Let's go ahead and drop the bombshell first. How did it review? Better than I thought it would. The golden number was 71.57, which is, yeah, that's better than I was thinking. If that's less than you were thinking it would be, well, it might help to explain it by mentioning that this game got a net plus 27 to story, which is really good, and a net plus 2 to gameplay. So, where do I begin? To really talk about Super Mario RPG is to talk about a comic book. This comic book, to be precise. This comic book is the origination, by everything I've been able to read and research and all that fun stuff, of the personality of Mario Brothers. Peach, Bowser, Luigi, Yoshi, and arguably Mario all had personality as a result of this comic. If it wasn't for this, I'm pretty sure that we never would have gotten to this, because sometime later, about probably about 2 years later, Miyamoto started shopping around and being like, hey, we should make a Mario RPG. Yeah, I know, Miyamoto wanted that. It's just a weird thought, isn't it? I think he was thinking more on the gameplay axis, which is funny when you think about it. But, so he was like, hey, let's do this. And right about this point in time, Square and Nintendo were doing pretty well together. There's some feedback related to this with regards to the Nintendo PlayStation, which I've actually already talked about, so I'm just mentioning that to say that particular fallout and the consequences thereof and the massive sea change to gaming that resulted from that all happened after this game was developed. So, pretty shortly after it came out, but before it was, before this game was developed and being put into production before that whole thing happened. It's relevant because the main reason why Square didn't come back, by every source I've been able to read, for Super Mario RPG 2 was because of that split. They had pretty much completely focused on the PlayStation, and that was that. Anyways, so Square was like, we'd really like to start working more on action RPGs and platforming. Remember that Square had been experimenting with action RPG as a concept, well, actually since FF4, with the ATB was their very first foray into that. And then they got into the Seiken Densetsu series with Sword of Mana on the Game Boy, sometimes referred to as Final Fantasy Adventure, and that game was kind of a drift into that direction as well. And, well, let's be honest, they've been drifting into the ARPG market ever since the early 90s. Like, I'm sure there's some exceptions there, but Square has been pushing pretty hard to be more ARPG than turn-based RPG for the better part of 3 decades now. Anyways, so the two got together and were like, hey, let's make a game. And they did, and it was Super Mario RPG. I could talk more about it, but honestly, that really is all you need to know. The two companies who already had a very good working relationship at this point and already had plenty of, cross-working together and sharing to text details and specifics and, how the SNES worked, getting the new chip in the Super Mario RPG cart and, working with the composers and the directors and the writers and all that. There was already a working relationship there. So they just said, let's just make a game. What's funny is there's another game at about this era which was made in almost the exact same manner. Chrono Trigger. But that's another time. We'll talk about that later. I think I've actually already done a remake Rumination on that. So we'll never actually do another video on that, but we'll stream that someday, hopefully. Anyways. So they made Super Mario RPG. I freely and embarrassedly lump myself into the category of people who said, a Mario RPG, that's stupid. That's like having a first-person Metroid game. What kind of nonsense is this? God. And then I played it. You ever have one of those things? I've had this several times in my life. It's a desire you never knew you had because you didn't know it. In ignorance, no insult intended, just in absence of knowledge, you didn't know that there's a thing that you really like, that you really enjoy, that you have now been exposed to, and it's like, aha! It's this light bulb moment. It's like, oh my God. I've had this several times, when I became aware of board games, real board games, with Settlers of Catan, or getting into strategy games with Civilization 2, Warcraft 1, and Command & Conquer 1. I could name several things where this has happened to me. I imagine it's happened to several of you at least at some point in your life. That was this game for me. Super Mario RPG was just I never realized I wanted this kind of a thing. And it's one of the biggest reasons why I've been such a fan of the Mario RPG series, off and on, over the course of its history. I still haven't actually played the latest one, the Origami King. I've got it. It's right there. It's just... Anyways, we'll see if that's actually worthwhile when we get there. But the point being, this was such a cool concept. And in having the party of Mario, Peach, and Bowser, which is my go-to team, by the way, is just kind of awesome. And fleshing out the world and seeing the dozens upon dozens of Toads and Koopas and Mole people and the Nimbus people and all these people and how they interact with each other and fleshing out the world and the humor and the comedy and the tone. It was just, oh my God, I never realized how much I wanted this until I became exposed to it. So that's all cool. I went ahead and played my way through it. It was legit, but at the same time, it was kind of, and young me didn't really know why. And that opinion never really changed. That's why this is part of this block. It's not a game I love. It's a game that I enjoyed with several caveats, but I wasn't sure what those caveats were. If you asked me yesterday before I started the stream what those caveats were, I would say that between the graphical style and the odd weirdness of the game, it just kind of pushed me out of it. And you're probably thinking, Lord, you like weirdness. I don't mean like Booster, who's awesome and the best character in the game. No, I mean like you're going through Smithy's factory and then there's a giant snake with a guy who's in some garish purple robes attacking you. Who are you? And why are you here? Who's Punchinello? Who's Mac? What's going on here? And just, there's several moments where the game is just unabashedly off. And it's always kind of pushed me away from the game. In the final equation, I only gave the game 1 negative for that particular thing because it was less than I remembered. But that just goes to show how much I didn't realize what was actually pushing me away from this game. Because anybody who saw the stream knows, as soon as I fired up the game, I was like, oh, this game is so good. Let's explain all the ways this game is so good. I'm not going to repeat myself because that's not how that works. That's what the stream is for. But I'm going to try and summarize. The game does an excellent job of weaning you into what it is. In fact, how many of you even notice that you're effectively invincible during the first portion of the game while you're trying to learn the ropes and the first few encounters before the Bowser fight? How many of you noticed that the game goes out of its way to make sure that you don't have to worry about most of the RPG mechanics until you figured out the combat mechanics? How many of you noticed that almost all of the tutorials are, of course, skippable, but if you don't skip them, the game goes out of its way to actually change some of the sequence of events and so forth and so on. There's a lot of things the game does to wean you into what is a game. What's the first boss in this game? 2 people who are trash mobs. That's odd. Why would trash mobs be the first boss of the game? I know. It's because you can skip every encounter up to that point. All of them. And not counting the tutorial fights against the 2 Koopas and Bowser. So, it is possible for the Hammer Brothers to be your 3rd encounter in the game. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's the speedrun route. So, they made sure that one of the first actual mandatory encounters, now that we're out of tutorial land, was just another trash encounter with a little bit more HP and a little bit more damage to get you used to things like timed hits and how to manage your HP and your output. What's the second boss? Croco. We'll talk about him in a minute. What's the third boss? Mac. Mac is your ad boss. He's trying to get you used to the concept of a boss who summons ads, and you have to juggle multiple encounters while dealing with the main thing, which is its own little mechanic and so forth and so on. And you see this pattern through most of the intro of the game, pretty much up to and including the fight against Mac and that conclusion. That's all pretty well designed with one caveat, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I'm going through and I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. Because the game does so many things right. So many simple things that you wouldn't even think is a big deal. Let me ask you something. How many of you have played a menu-based RPG? I imagine if you're watching this video and listening to these words right now, you probably have. So, okay, obviously memory cursor can help with this sort of thing, but how many of you have counted how many seconds you spend, going down, 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 selecting this spell and doing this, and okay, and there we go. Done. Or selecting this fight or going through this item or whatever. Okay, done. Now that may sound like a minor thing, and it absolutely is. But what this game did was it got rid of one of those steps by putting it on the XAB buttons, X-A-Y-B, or Y-B, excuse me. And so, X-A-B-Y. And so what you end up doing is you take away maybe a second from every menu input in the entire game across every combat. Something I talk about often is the concept of seconds and minutes, when a game has some kind of unnecessary padding to it, like menuing, or animations, or loading, or something that's minor. It's usually only a second or 2, but it happens constantly, and so, because it happens so constantly, it stretches the game out. Super Mario RPG does several things which do the exact opposite and shrink the game. I smashed through this game in 12.5 hours, and we did almost all the optional content. We didn't do the mega optional content because that's just a grind at that point. We didn't beat Kulek, for example. But we did pretty much everything. And that's all it was. It was only 12 and a half hours. But that makes perfect sense because the game does constant, tiny little improvements, optimizations, micro optimizations even, which make the game flow and move much more smoothly. Getting into combat takes only half a second, and you're immediately in there, and then you immediately start selecting your things, and then go. There's no camera pan, there's no thing with the music starting up or whatever. It's just bam, combat, and then you're out, and then you level or don't level, and you're right back out to the exact spot at which you left the game at. No in between, just bam, done. And there's lots of stuff like that. There is a menu cursor, of course, a memory cursor, which can help with stuff like that on the main menu. When you're going to equip items, if you're trying to equip, it'll only let you select things. So let me try to explain this. Let's say you have a massive inventory of items of like weapons, armor, and accessories. But let's say you only have in this giant list one piece of gear that you want to put on Bowser. So you go down to Bowser's armor and you select them. What does it do? It immediately goes to that armor. Again, this only saves like a second, maybe two. But those tiny little micro optimizations are everywhere in the gameplay, and it's one of the things I was most impressed by. That, and of course, the aforementioned action RPG thing, which I already mentioned, the timed hits. Ironically, Square would kind of abandon this idea almost immediately, whereas Nintendo would embrace it arguably too much. I love Mario and Luigi Dream Team as much as anybody, but I think that's officially the line at which timed hits became stupid. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Timed hits is when you have to do a specific input, not necessarily just a button press. Maybe it's a mash, maybe it's a hold, maybe it's rotate the controller, but you do something in order as part of the combat. It's a way to kind of in between turn-based and action-based. Now, this system in its core concept is something I enjoy. I did not give a plus to this game for that system. You're probably thinking, Laura, you're dumb and you're stupid. You're absolutely right. But in this case, the reason I didn't is because this is the prototype in every sense of the word of that system. And it's got problems. There's visual disparity in some attacks, especially some of the enemy attacks, which are sometimes misleading and sometimes actively deceptive on when you should block in order to block them. Some of the special attacks you do aren't really super clear on when you should start doing an input and when you should stop. Gino is very big about that. Some of the inputs are variable based on what is effectively RNG or random position because there's inconsistent hitboxes when it comes to the enemies and you, and so forth and so on. The game doesn't even explain the fact that critical timed things are actually a thing in this game, because they are, for those of you who didn't know. No, I was actually paying attention. Nowhere in the game does it even mention that. I'm not even sure if it was in the manual. I'm not sure. I haven't had my manual in a long time. I mention all this because this is my point. It is the beginnings of a good system, but it's not a good system itself. I think by the time we got to Paper Mario, the system was polished enough to actually now officially be a good system and something that can actually really truly add to the gameplay, the very definition of a gameplay positive. But this game absolutely gets credit for that. So I mentioned this something too. Speaking of getting credit, well, no, let's. I'll do that segue later. Change my mind. I swear I plan these out. I just change my mind sometimes on the fly. Kind of go with the flow, you know. You want to do some front loading and you want to do some back loading. So what I want to talk about next is how the gameplay suffers. So with all of these awesome techniques and all of these concepts and all this stuff, the first part of the game is just joy, right? Wrong. How many of you have died to the first Croco fight? Hell, I don't even have to prove that. I died this time to the first Croco fight. And how many of you have died to the second Croco fight? So, obviously this game has some of the issues of the old games, but it doesn't have most of them. Like, you don't have random encounters, and the game's not particularly grindy. In fact, this game is kind of anti-grindy. I was multiple levels under the expected level of where I should be because I was avoiding almost every encounter, and yet I was still able to do what I was doing because I know the game well enough to do that, and I'm actually pretty decent at most of the time to it. So, yay, woo, right? But at the same time, the game doesn't quite support that. The game feels like it needed more polishing passes, is how I would actually describe it. In fact, if I was to speculate, and this is pure speculation based on observation and analysis, I would say that what happened was they got to about the 80 or so % point of being done with the game, and then for whatever reason, they just dropped. They just said, we're done. Maybe they ran into a deadline. Maybe there were budget issues. Maybe there was drama between the two companies. Maybe there was issues with Sony. I don't know. I don't have any information on that. I actually looked. I wasn't able to find anything codified or specific enough to be worth mentioning, other than vague rumors, which I don't like to report on. So, what we have is a game that feels unfinished. Now, I know that sounds strange when referring to a game that is as beloved as this, but please think about this for a moment. What do you think the difficulty curve for this game is? Like, if you were to visualize it. Because it starts off, here, and then it does the spike with Croco, and then it bumps down. Then it goes up here, then it goes down here, and then we get here, and then we go to the Rose Woods, and then we go up to this, and we have a cool boss fight, and it's kind of going up. And then it has another spike with Croco, too. And then it goes right back down. Then we go over here, and then we go up, and then down, and here, and this, and this. And it's an extremely inconsistent difficulty curve. But the specific reason why is always two things. Trash encounters and boss design. Here's the thing. The reason I'm labeling these things so specifically, I'm spending so much attention on it, is this is the stuff that usually requires polishing passes, going back over and over and over the details, the data, and the playtesting in order to really polish it into an excellent encounter. Most of the story bosses, that is to say the smithy minions, are actually reasonably well designed, but even that isn't 100% true. How many of you have had issues with the Axum Rangers, for example? Or Yuridovich is another fairly common one. So, it feels like they needed to do a few more polishing passes. Some of the bosses are overtuned. Some of the bosses are undertuned. How many of you died to that damn cake, for example? And here's the thing, too. It feels like not a lot of thought was put into most of the encounters in the middle part of the game. Pretty much everything from, I would say, let's go with Croco 2. I know Croco 1 has issues, but we'll start with Croco 2, because Bowyer is actually pretty good. It's actually probably one of the better fights in the game. But we've got Croco 2 all the way over to the Axum Rangers fight. This gargantuan middle chunk of the game feels like they didn't put the polish into it that they did the rest of it. And even some of the random, just out-of-nowhere bosses in the final two dungeons still feel like they had more thought and effort put into them, into designing them, as opposed to the stuff in the middle. Here's a good example. Yuridovich. Have you ever had issues with him? Yeah, probably, if you've played this game, especially if you've played this game blind and without a strategy guide, because nothing indicates that he is specifically weak to lightning. He is not weak to anything else. In fact, he has really high stats across the board. But if you happen to bring Mallow to that fight, you will be able to do decent damage to him. He still has a crap ton of health, and he is still a bit of a climb, but that's okay. He's a major boss, sure. But he's weak to lightning, which nothing indicates anywhere ever. Huh? This is doubly weird because if you consider it, the time to make a boss weak to lightning would either be when Mallow just joined the party, pretty typical way to get you used to how Mallow is useful, or when Mallow is relevant to the story, like over in the Nimbus section. Neither of these are true. It's Yuridovich who's really the big one here. Huh? And then there's the Bunt Cake. Now, the Bunt Cake, it has its own issues. There's the knock out the lights candle thing, which it doesn't explain all. It just says turn out the candles. I'm like, okay, how? Nothing explains the mechanics of how that works. But here's why the Bunt fight really sucks. Because what happens is you hit the save point, then you knock open the door, fly through, have a fairly long cutscene, unskippable cutscene. Then you have to do a minigame of finding Princess Peach's stuff. Then you go talk to Peach, there's a cutscene, there's the smooch of whatever version you got, and then the cutscene continues, and then the Koopas bring in the cake, and then they talk to you, and they get upset, and then you fight the Koopas, and then the boss fight starts. And you see the problem. This is the Seymour problem all over again, having to watch the entire cutscene every time we fail on a difficult boss fight, which isn't properly explained. You see the problems? But I mentioned trash encounters, too. Really pay attention the next time you play, or just search your memories right now, or watch the VOD. You'll notice that as you're going through the game, there's just enemies everywhere. They're littered throughout the dungeons. They are constant. In several rooms, you have upwards of 5, in some cases around 10 enemies per room, which may not sound like a lot, but when you're going down a narrow staircase, which is only 2 things wide, that's a lot of enemies. And the further you are into the game, up to Bowser's Castle, up to Nimbus, as I mentioned earlier, the Axum Rangers, actually. The further you are into the game, the harder it is to dodge encounters. The game goes out of its way to make it very difficult to do so. Nimbus is probably the worst dungeon in the game with regards to dodging encounters and simply not interacting with them. Because there's stuff everywhere in your way, and you're going on narrow platforms, and if you fall down, right, you get it. But why is that an issue? Well, because every one of those encounters is a whole encounter it's not just that one enemy, it's like 5 enemies. The relevance here, and this is where all these systems kind of fall apart for me. It's kind of the opposite problem of Resident Evil 4, where all those systems all work together to flow beautifully. Here, all the systems are in contrast to each other. So we have a full action ability to jump, move, and run around on the overworld like it was a platformer, and there is platforming in this game. The enemy distribution feels like it was done from a platformer perspective, which would be fine if that's how it worked, which it isn't. You'll notice in later games, most notably Paper Mario 1, but also Paper Mario 2, you actually can't have as many enemies per encounter as you can here, except for very, very rare exceptions. And if you happen to, for example, get in a first hit, like jumping on an enemy or hitting it with a hammer, then you get an initial oomph onto getting through that encounter, which helps smooth this kind of problem over sufficiently. Less enemy health, less enemies, quicker, ways to reward the player for going through it makes the encounter problem almost go away. But even then, in Paper Mario, the number of encounters per screen is substantially reduced from this game because it feels like it was designed for a platformer. And nobody actually thought about that. Nobody did anything to sween that out. So, okay, that's the first problem. The second problem is encounters honestly get kind of irritating after a certain point in time, despite all the work that I mentioned earlier, which is still there to make encounters go smoothly and all that. They just get kind of dull to fight after a while, especially since, and this is probably going to be the most unpopular thing I say today, that battle music can go to hell. The actual song's fine. If you listen to it in a vacuum, it's fine. That's not what you hear in the game. What you hear is bam, 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 and then you beat the enemy. And then you fight the next one, you go, bam, 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 and you just hear the first 10 seconds of those freaking horns, or whatever those are, over and over and over, and it just gets grating. I actually had people complain. In fact, I had one person leave the stream because of that exact same issue, and I was trying to dodge everything I could. I happen to know this game reasonably well, and I know how to dodge most of the enemies, so, I was kind of prepped for that. Imagine playing this game blind. This leads into the third problem. The enemies aren't rewarding. The level cap in this game is roughly 30. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I know it's around, I'm pretty sure it actually is 30, so forgive me for being vague about that. I finished this game at about level 21, and I wasn't really trying, and in fact, as I mentioned earlier, I was avoiding most encounters. The reason I bring all that up is you don't have to level in this game, which is good. This is not a grindy game, unless you're going for Kulex, which honestly you don't even have to do that. You don't really have to grind up. The game also does the Dragon Quest thing, where every single level up is sufficient. This is also part of one thing the game does well, which is its itemization. So, equipment raises your stats, level up raises your stats. I mean, duh. But my point is, when each stat is significant, when even a single point of attack power is a substantial increase, then everything increases your power sufficiently. Now, this isn't quite as good as later games do. In fact, if you're paying attention, they would once again take this formula and refine it in Paper Mario. Rather than having, 128 health, you'd have 10. But all the precepts still apply. The scaling still applies the same way. They just removed all of that so that every single stat is noticeably, visibly, obviously, immediately, apparently, a significant increase in up. Just like it is in this game, but more so. You get the idea. So, your power level goes up significantly, and your equipment is distributed significantly, but the enemies don't really give much to be worthwhile. It's actually too easy to cap out your gold, so that's not really a big motivator. I mean, how many of you have had the problem of just running around with 999 gold, and that's just it, and you're just stuck there because you don't have anything to spend it on except fireworks, which cost 500, which is irritating in its own right, but you get the idea. So it's like, okay. So you're never low on gold, and you don't need that much experience, so all the enemy encounters become is a waste of time. And this is how all these things kind of flow together and kind of make the game more of a hassle than it should be. But even all of this doesn't really become a problem until that stupid cake. So first you have to fight the cake. And this is the exact moment at which the game enters the doldrums period for me. Because you fight the cake, and then you go to Seaside, and then you go to the ship. And then you fight some really irritating bosses. And if you don't know what you're doing on Johnny, you fight an extremely unfair fight against Johnny himself. By the way, I looked it up. Johnny is strong against fire and jump attacks. Sorry, let me say that more clearly. The solo fight, the one you fight with just Mario, is strong against jump and fire. Think about that for a second. So nothing, if you keep the ads alive, you don't have to deal with that. But nothing tells you that, of course. You can just observe it and hope that you figure it out. By the way, There's a pretty big sequence of events from the previous save to Johnny, too. And there's multiple encounters, too, actually, before you get there. Sounds familiar. Then you go through Land's End. I hate Land's End. I don't have anything to add to that. It's just this nice, long, boring slog with irritating platforming. That's the summary there. And some irritating bosses. Then you go to Nimbus. Pause. From a story axis, Nimbus is awesome. We'll talk about that later. Unpause. But Nimbus, from a gameplay perspective, sucks for the reasons I already talked about. Very, very irritating fights with way too much health. At this point, I was already quite high levels. I was already like level 19 at this point, so I was just smashing through, right? Nope, they still take too long, and they're very irritating to dodge. They actually get in your way. There are some that are literally blocking the doors just to make sure you fight them, and so forth and so on, in very narrow corridors and blah, 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 blah. And then you get to the Volcano. Actually, the Volcano is okay, but then you have to fight the Tsar Dragon immediately before fighting the Zombo, and immediately before fighting the Axum Rangers, immediately before fighting Blade. There's actually one pause in the middle of there. After fighting Zombo, and you can go back and save. It's kind of irritating to do so, and it feels like you're not supposed to, but you can, so that's something. Then you go fight the Axum Rangers, which themselves are kind of counterintuitive, because despite the obvious logic of going after the healer first, in fact, going after the healer first is usually not a really great strategic decision, because she has decent defenses and decent health, and her heals are random. So she just heals random people, regardless of who actually needs health. By contrast, going after green first, the mage, who has very low defenses, usually results in knocking him off the board pretty much immediately. I just mentioned that because I talked about that on stream, and it makes the fight a lot easier. But you get my point. Then the game starts being designed well again. Bowser's Castle is probably the best dungeon in the entire game. And then you go through the awesome outro, which is a good time to pause. Do you see the overall tone there? Gameplay-wise, and that's the game. This is very much like another game I've actually already reviewed, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which I know a lot of you are like, that game sucks, and that's fine. But the interesting thing about Mystic Quest is its intro is legit and its outro is awesome. It is the middle part that sucks and gets grindy and boring and stupid and dull. And hey, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? I bring all this up because that is why I don't enjoy this game as much as other people, and that is why I always had that mental ugh when it came to this game. I now understand and fully can express that thought, which is what I'm doing to you. There's other little niggling details about, specifics of interface or visuals or all that, but that's the big thing. Let's talk about the narrative. Now, ironically, I don't have much to say about the narrative, even though it is by far the best part about the game, because it's the Mario RPG. It began the Mario RPG concepts. What is this game? Watch the intro for a second, just in your mind, if you will. So what happens in the intro? We've got this lighthearted, silly fight. Mario's going through, and he beats up Bowser. Bowser's like, wah, ha, 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 but I'm not really evil. I'm just kind of comical. Again, the same thing that was established here. And so Bowser's not super evil, and he's kind of lighthearted, and he kind of is making jokes. He actually literally makes a joke. It's a chain reaction. And then you fight him, and you beat him, and everything's cool. And it's all lighthearted, silly fun. Then a giant sword smashes through the sky, sending chunks of a star everywhere, and smashes into the sword. And a haunting melody plays. I bet you can hear it in your head right now. That little, it's a piano piece, I want to say, or maybe a harpsichord or something like that. Maybe it's a harp, I don't know, but it's some kind of percussive instrument. It's just go dun, 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 dun. And that establishes the tone of the game right there, because the intro is brilliant at this. Because there are two tones for this game. Lighthearted, silly fun, comedy, and horrifying darkness. And I love it. It's very Dragon Quest-y, or very Yakuza-y if you want, or very Zelda-y. Zelda does the same thing. And it is very Mario RPG-y. The game goes out of its way to have this kind of silly zaniness just in its very presentation. One of the things that I've always loved, but I never really realized how much I loved, was the animations. Now, I always pay attention to these kind of things because animation is a very important thing in how a game can express its story. In modern games, animation means motion capture, but back in the days, they had to kind of make do with whatever, right? But they do so much with it. Do me a favor, next time you play this game, or just picture in your head, picture right now Mario explaining to the Chancellor in the Mushroom Kingdom what happened at Bowser's Castle. Picture that little puppetry scene he does as he can... And then all of that. And it's not even the big obvious stuff like the puppetry scenes. In almost every scene, there's some other character in the background who's like reacting to what's going on. There's a scene where Bowser is talking to the Koopa Troop. I can't remember his name. Jagger, I think is his name, in Monstro Town. And Bowser pops out of Mario, and Mario's standing, and the two are talking, and Bowser's like, hey, everything's cool. And at a certain point, Bowser says, no, you're cool, and I got your back, and everything's awesome. And Bowser's just kind of a bro, because Bowser's awesome in this game. Mario, when Bowser be-cools, Mario just turns to look at him. It's such a tiny little thing, but there's little snippets like that everywhere. When Frogfucius is giving his big speech about how you have to go out into the world, he's shaking slightly, because he's restraining himself from crying. When oh god, I can't remember the kid's name. The kid who had the Geno doll. Oh, by the way, how do you pronounce Geno? When the kid had the Geno doll, and he's like, oh man, Mario sure needs all the help he can get, and wanders off. Mario has to be physically restrained by Mallow for punching the kid, for insulting him, etc. There's all sorts of that stuff, and the animation is on point constantly. I have nothing but praise for the animation team, and the storyboarding is surprisingly good too. There are straight-up action sequences in this game with animated sprites, and they're very well done. And then, of course, there's the characters. I kind of already talked about this. Bowser is just kind of this awesome, lovable goofball who's not evil and not anything. He's just one of the first, well, actually more like the fourth scene we see him in, but probably his first establishing scene, right before he joins the party, is he's literally crying. He's got these giant tears just dangling from his eyes. He's like, oh, shoot, he saw me. Hey, what's up? Oh, shoot, no, he's gonna think about, okay, hang on, I've got this. Out of my way, I'm Bowser. Yeah, I love it. I love the tone there. What I think of as Bowser initiated, well, from the comic, but also from this game. I keep referencing this stupid comic, but let me be clear. This comic innovated, but this game codified. This game made that Bowser. Peach, oh no, I'm so scared and everything, but also I'm going to sneak out on my own, and I'm going to smack the crap out of people and be the major healer, and arguably the most powerful character in the game. That's Peach. Her best weapon is a freaking frying pan, which she can hit for more than Bowser can, unless you give her the lazy shell, of course, which I usually do. I mean, right? And so, Peach is awesome, Bowser is awesome, Mario is beautifully characterized for a character who doesn't even speak. We also have Booster, I mentioned him earlier. Booster is, so I mentioned weird. The weird I'm talking about is just the random off the ball, has nothing to do with anything bizarrety. Booster is funny. I love that section of the game. It's such a shame that it ends with that freaking cake fight, but the Booster section of the game, going through Booster's Tower and going through Marymore on the story axis, is nothing but positives. I love it. He has to have the concepts of a party and a cake. One of my favorite lines of the entire game is, sir, there's probably a 70% chance that what you're standing on is in fact a cake. It's one of my favorite lines in the whole game. He's been doing this whole wedding so he could have a party which involves drinking punch and eat cake, which sounds very complicated. He's not sure if he can muster the energy for this. Booster's awesome. I can only gush about him. But he is very specifically designed because he's not just an idiot like this kind of archetype usually is. It's more like he's disconnected. It's more like this is someone who is an alien who is having human concepts explained to him. That is how he's written. Not like he's an idiot, but that he's completely ignorant. Oh, there's some... You're leaking, my dear. Tastes salty. Oh, disgusting. That might be corrosive. Because he doesn't know what crying is. Keep in mind, he has already cried at this point in time, and so forth and so on. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the massive cast of secondary characters, which, God, I couldn't even possibly just sit here and list them all. There's so many characters and flavor. There's at the beginning of the game, you actually meet Raz and Rainy, who are going to go for their wedding. And then you meet them again at Marymore, and then you can meet them again when they've actually settled down, and just, it's, oh my god. There's the Toad Guard, who forgot his bazooka. There's the Tadpoles at the Tadpole place. There's Toadofsky, who's trying to figure out his thing. Frogfucius, of course, and his whole thing. I'm not going to go down the list. There are many supporting characters, and an enormous amount of effort was put into giving flavor to all of them. The localization on this game is on point. There are some issues, most notably with the psychopath. So let me explain that for a second, because that probably sounds weird if you don't know what I'm talking about. Psychopath is an ability that Mallow has where he reads the minds of an enemy. It also tells him, what their health is at the moment. it gives a random quote. Now, normally that kind of stuff is cool. You'll notice this eventually would turn into the tattle ability for Goombario and Goombella in Paper Mario 1 and 2. But here, it gives nonsense. I'd say close to 90% of the time, the stuff you get has nothing to do with anything at all. That's mostly because, from what I've been able to determine, there was a disconnect between which enemies got which thing. So rather than saying, this is what this is, it was just enemy entry 315. And so the translators were like, feeling fine, and they would just put random stuff there, because who knows, right? Some of it was mistranslated jokes from the Japanese version. Some of it is just not translated at all. Some of it's completely invented stuff, and so forth and so on. There's actually a lot of issues like that, but most of them are of the tiny little thing and are not in the foreground. The actual dialogue on screen is actually quite excellent. It's weird how good it is throughout the course of this game, especially having just played Parasite Eve, which has a substantially worse localization than this game, which predates it by a bit and a generation, like a console generation. Gosh, what else does this game do right other than everything? On the story axis, let me talk about my favorite thing to talk about. Now, let me just jump forward. I mean, I could tell you about how Johnny was intended to be a major character because the game constantly goes out of its way to put him up as this awesome, super cool dude, and nobody cares. I can mention how Gino was a smash success for no perceivable reason, because ultimately Gino's actual role in the narrative is just to be kind of the person who's there to explain the plot to you. I mean, Gino's cool and all. I don't think he's a negative, but I've never really understood the hype about Gino personally. If anybody wants to explain it, please feel free in the comments below. Mallow is actually really cool. He actually has probably the most story significance of any of the party members. He has 2 entire chapters, if you could call it that, dedicated towards him and his discovery of himself and what he's doing and growing up to be a stronger person and meeting his family and where he's from and all that fun. He actually has a character arc. He's really the only one who does. I've already talked about Bowser and Peach, how they're awesome in Mario. Luigi isn't in the game. He was supposed to be. He was in the beta screenshots. I can talk about a lot of things, but what I want to talk about is Smithy. So let's address what is in the game, what is factual and as presented. The Smithy gang have access to a multi-dimensional sword which can travel between worlds. That's XOR. XOR serves as this kind of a dimensional anchor and can then allow them to invade this new world. This is possibly the first time they've done this. There's some evidence going one way or the other, but I like to think that this is actually their first invasion after their initial, and I'll kind of lead up to why in a minute. So, they have their invasion. Everything's cool. Neato. XOR just kind of maintains the portal and slowly pushes out Smithy minions, and they slowly take over the world, and everything's cool. Cool. The destruction of the Star Road was completely incidental. In fact, it was completely accidental. They didn't even know what a Star Road was or how they interacted with it until we fought Bowyer. And Gino explained to us what the significance of the Star Road was, and one of Smithy's minions happened over here, and that's how Smithy became aware of it. Already interesting in its own right. What's doubly interesting is if you pay attention to the narrative, fixing the Star Road is neat and all, but it's not actually the goal of the game. Stopping Smithy is the goal of the game. The game just is kind of coy about that. As you go through the game, more and more hints of the nature of Smithy and who and what he is are dropped here and there. We get tidbits about how certain people will actually rust if they have to swim, but there's nothing for it. There's intimations about there being production issues, and there's more... the way you get up in the ranks is by pleasing your boss. That's something Yuridovich mentions, and something that the general manager in the factory mentions. There's all these little tidbits and hints. I'm not going to be as overt as I was on stream, but all I'm going to say is what we have here is what I call negative space characterization. So, to go back to the art terms, negative space is when you draw something by not drawing it, right? If I was to make a whole painting except for this heart shape in the middle, which is just blank, I have now drawn a heart. I haven't actually done anything with that heart. There is no heart there. But I have now intimated this heart into you. That sounds like a weird sentence. As a result of how I've drawn it, right? It's the same thing when it comes to storytelling. Now, I love it when a story pulls this off properly. It is also extremely rare because it's very hard to do. You need to characterize without the character ever being on screen. One of my favorite examples of this is actually Sauron. And indeed, Sauron, in many ways, I believe, was a legitimate inspiration for Smithy. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But so, we get these little tidbits and hints of how Smithy and the Smithy gang operate. And all of this leads up to the big fight with Exor. How many of you thought Exor was Smithy back in the day? I'm going to raise my hand on this one. Now, the game doesn't say it one way or the other. The game doesn't clarify who Exor is all the way through the game until you actually are fighting the Sword and Neo Squid for some reason. The reason I bring this up, most of you are probably aware of this, but on the off chance you're not, it is my belief that the biggest reason that people believed the Sword was Smithy, other than the vagueness of the game itself, is because of a Nintendo Power issue which flat out called the Sword Smithy. Here's the thing. Nintendo Power made a lot of mistakes back in the day, and that was kind of a common thing. Playing Spot the Mistake and some of the things was a thing that me and my friends used to play. I'm not sure this was a mistake. I find myself wondering if this was a deliberate marketing tool, since Lord knows the Sword certainly has a lot of presence. Ignoring the fact that it's always visible and from almost every... I'm saying that wrong. If you zoom out the map, you can always see it from everywhere. And it's one of the biggest things on the world map, and it kind of takes front and center, and the whole title screen plays over it, and so forth and so on. It's got a lot of presence. But that's not Smithy. That's just a door. And that's kind of my point. We have this whole build-up, and then we go through that door, and we end up in hell. One of the questions I was asked on stream is, what is worse, Kefka's goal or Smithy's goal? And I said Smithy. And that's because, to me, a world that is not is worse than a world that is just an unescapable, unmittable hell. So now we're going to enter the realm of speculation. But before I go forward, I would love to know your thoughts on Smithy, who, how, why, and what. But if you pay attention, so all of this is speculation born from analysis, as it usually is. But none of this is codified canon, which is why I make the distinction. I didn't used to make that distinction like 10 years ago. I didn't make those in, and I feel stupid about that. But nowadays I try to be a lot more clear. This is speculation. Smithy has consumed his entire world. We see this in the visuals that we see as we go throughout the factory. We see this in the style and presentation of everything there. One of the things that's mentioned is any dissension is met with being melted down, which means there are members of Smithy's gangs that are melted down and reprocessed because they're all crafted. In fact, it is very heavily implied that every single member of Smithy's gang, 100% of them, are automatons of one matter or another, technological, magical, or both, crafted by Smithy. Now that makes perfect sense. We see him literally doing it. We see the factory lines. We go through the factory until we get close to the conveyor belts. What's the name of all the enemies in the factory? Machine made. It's so dehumanizing. It's so depersonalizing. It's even worse than having a serial code. Someone said on camera, I forget who it is. I forget it. It's even worse than that. Because all you are is the same. All you are is machine-made. Nothing more. What do we see as we're going through there? A hideous, dark, pollution-infested, gray, dead landscape of cogs and gears and chunks of weapon. Just chunks of missiles or chunks of factory. And what are the enemies there? Mutated monsters, weapons, and the dead. Now, every Mario RPG has a rather dark and horrifying element to it. Where it is and how it's expressed varies substantially, but they've always done this since Super Mario RPG, and this is where it really kicks into gear here. Because what we see is a dead world of just weapons. And what is the threat he lists to Peach? Imagine if I could get rid of all your hope, get rid of all your wishes, and make a world filled with weapons. He wants to do what he's already done to his world, to the Mushroom Kingdom. This, we see in the factory, his goal. That's what he wants from the Mushroom Kingdom. This is where the Sauron parallels really come in. The whole industry thing that Tolkien was really big on. You get the idea. But what we also see is that all of those entities are effectively slaved to him. And I can't believe I'm making this comparison, but Smithy is a better character than the jailer is. If you don't know who I'm talking about, don't worry about it, because I'm not going to go through the whole context. But if you understand the context, the point here is they're even the same archetype. Because they're the big bad who we barely interact with until we find out that they've been behind everything the whole time, and they're mostly characterized through negative characterization, right? And their goals are almost identical. They want to have total control and domination over everything, right? Except here's the big trick. So first of all, Super Mario RPG does it much better. But second of all, when we get to the final part of the final dungeon, the amazing song for the factory goes away, and what we instead have is just like a 3-second loop. And yet, unlike some of the earlier music songs, which are repetitive to the point of irritating, this is brilliant in how it's presented. It's just a factory line. All we hear is the machine work thudding in the background endlessly. Because that's all it is. Because that's all there is. And everyone we talk to, as we have our little character moments, everyone there is all... we got to make sure that we do the best for Smithy, and we got to promote him and make sure everything's going perfectly, and anybody who's dissented will be melted down, and so forth and so on. And they're all trying to uplift this concept as they're trying to expand his goals, and it all boils down to a Smithy who doesn't give a damn about any of them, because why would he? They're just tools. But here's where things really twist. So we defeat Smithy 1. Cool fight. Great boss music. And then we fall down below the factory we're in, and we land on a giant molten pile of smithies. I'm going to pause right here. What's your explanation? What's your headcanon, your thought, your speculation? What did you think back in the day? What do you think now? This is never explained. I'm just gonna give that away. This is never explained. There's a giant version of Smithy's head in the background, and we're standing on a giant pile of his head. So what is this? My theory is that whoever used to live on this world made Smithy, an automaton, probably not even fully sentient or sapient. And they made him to make weapons. This, to me, is substantially more horrifying than active malice or other things like, Sauron, for example. Instead, what we have is just a factory that has gone completely out of control. 30 go to 10. And I love how chilling that is. The implication that Smithy either has been constantly building on himself, or that there used to be many other Smithies and he's the only one left. The implication, especially when everything goes grayscale during the ending, is very much that Smithy's world will now be a completely dead husk. It's uplifting because we're leaving that and we prevented that from happening to the Mushroom Kingdom. But that implication is still there. Like I said, the outro's legit. This is actually one of the better outros of the era. I think this actually beats, say, FF4, for example, in overall quality, and FF5. Not sure it hits FF6 or Chrono Trigger territory, but it's certainly up there. This is some damn good stuff, and it leaves you with stuff to think about. And it's a game that I'll probably never properly replay, but then again, I never really did that back in the day either. See, what I used to do, and I'm curious how many of you used to do the same, is I used to have saves at certain points. So sometimes I'd just replay the beginning of the game, and then I get to the Karo sewers and like, And I would have a save right after the Punchinella fight. So right before the booster section. And then I would have a save right at the Nimbus section. But the save I would go back to most, the one that was in the 5 slot. If I was to pull up my SNES cartridge right now, assuming the battery still works, I bet that save is still there. It's my super maxed save, where I did everything. Except 100 jumps. I never actually managed that on the SNES. But so it's almost super max, like 99%ed. And that particular save is the one I'd load. And it's right there at Smithy's final dungeon. Go through, final boss, outro, because it was just that good and that enjoyable and that interesting to go back through on repeats. And that's the part I will probably replay going forwards. I hope, as always, that you have enjoyed. As a reminder, there will be no stream Saturday because that's my Christmas, because scheduling. But we will be starting up whatever game is next. One of the Modern Warfares. I'm not sure which. I think it's the Modern Warfare remake. That'll be starting Tuesday. I do hope you've enjoyed. I'll see you next time.